Hey there everyone, this is Leo from TechLine PCs, and today we're going to be upgrading my own personal rig with what is one of the beefiest graphic cards of the current generation, the AMD Radeon 7900XTX by Sapphire. But before we get into unboxing it, this video is brought to you by us over at TechLinePCs.com, where you can check out our store for custom mid-range builds, along with our consolation page, where you can fill in whether you'd like an upgrade, a new build, a pre-built PC, along with a budget, and we'll work with you on the PC of your choice. Check us out again over at TechLinePCs.com. Now, after a little over a year and a half of owning one, I decided that I was due to replace my NVIDIA RTX 3070, and for the first time in quite a few graphic card generations, switched from Team Green back over to Team Red by going with the AMD Radeon RX 7900XTX. This absolutely thick card is the first time I dove into a brand new enthusiast tier card in my own personal systems. On top of that, I haven't used an AMD card in my personal computer since the HD 4850 15 years ago to play games like Left 4 Dead and Fallout. I wanted something with an incredible amount of video memory, along with a performance uplift to boot, to help with not only the top-of-the-line 1440p gaming that I'm doing, but the amount of video editing that I've been putting in lately as well, with videos like this one. I also did look into its direct competitor, the NVIDIA RTX 4080, and though they both offer near identical performance, the 4080 costs anywhere between $150 to $250 premium over the 7900XTX, so as a price to performance, this just happened to be a better card as well. Plus, the 7900XTX did come with a free copy of Resident Evil 4, which I'm definitely going to be playing right after this gets installed. Now with all the paperwork, screws, and even the support bracket out of the way, let's get to peeling the 7900XTX itself out over here and go over its specs. Running an absolutely insane 24 gigs of 384-bit GDDR6 memory, I guarantee I won't be seeing a bottleneck on that end in gaming anytime soon. Running a core clock of 1855 MHz with a boost clock of 2525, supporting two HDMI 2.1 and two DisplayPort 2.1 ports, so technically it can do 8K video, I guess, but I'll actually settle down with this for 1440p gaming for now. Now, there's no special power connectors in it as well, like the NVIDIA current generation has, but it does use three 8-pin PCI Express power connectors, which is one more than the AMD reference model. The Sapphire model we're seeing here in particular also comes with a triple fan design to help a ton with not only cooling the card, but keeping noise levels down, and more than enough heat pipes in it to hit all the critically hot components around the PCB. Another reason I chose this one matches my case's aesthetic. I've got an all black and red case, so I wanted to make sure that the black and red card was going to go with it, and this definitely does fit the bill. But now that the card's fully unboxed, let's just make sure to get this thing completely peeled out and installed. Satisfying as always. Let's go get my rig out over onto the table and see about getting this installed. Oh, and for a quick size comparison, check out the Sapphire 7900XTX next to the Sapphire 6400 low-profile GPU. I might even do a hilarious head-to-head between the best of this generation against the weakest of the last generation, so make sure to like and subscribe so you can tune into that bloodbath. As for the install, we'll get the case onto the table and remove both of the side panels. I'm also setting aside two extra 8-pin power connectors as my current video card only uses one, so I'll be needing these for the upgrade as well. We'll remove the power cable from the 3070 and unscrew the two screws holding it onto the case, leaving the converter cable in the card that we'll still need for its new home in my husband's PC, who is still using an old GTX 1060 6GB card, so it's actually going to be a pretty nice upgrade for him. Then we'll pop out the card using the tip of a screwdriver to press down onto the PCIe release, and out the card comes. And for the RX 7900XT installation, which definitely takes up way more space than my 3070 ever did, it's as simple as just popping it right into the slot that the 3070 came out of. The card installs super simple, slides and plugs right on in. I was a little bit concerned about the length, but this fractal case that I'm using is more than wide enough for an upgrade like this. If you're upgrading to a larger card, make sure to consult your case's manual to make sure that it'll actually fit with your upgrade. I'll also need to see about getting the support bracket installed as well. 3-slot GPUs like this are so large that it's incredibly recommended to have a support bracket in order to prevent the GPU from sagging and inevitably breaking from their own weight if installed in a horizontal setup like this. Vertically mounted GPUs definitely had an advantage on this end. This bracket that came with the card in particular mounts by screwing right onto the same expansion slots that the GPU is using. Then the rubber portion is adjusted to a spot in the card that it could safely press onto that'll help a ton with reinforcing its own weight. Once we found the safe area, aka not where the fans are located, we press up on it and screw tightly into position, successfully reinforcing the graphics card. Now I couldn't actually fit my cables by snaking them under the card like you see with most builds, so I had to go over the card instead. Still works just fine, just a different type of padding than I would usually use. Now once the 3 8-pin connectors are in, we're off to the races. Let's go check out how big of an upgrade we've got with a full 10-game benchmark suite, along with some crazy anomalies that I've seen during my testing. Now this won't be so much of a head-to-head between these two graphics cards, and it's more of just going to show what kind of a performance uplift I'm going to have going from the 3070 to the 7900XTX. And we're going to start off with some esports titles first, beginning with Counter-Strike Global Offensive. Now this one's going to be incredibly strange, and I think I might have to do something with the CPU that's going on. With the 3070 at 1080p, we had 609 FPS going with the first test that I did, and 468 FPS going at 1440p. When I jumped over to the 7900XTX, our frame rate pretty much went to an unnoticeable difference here, with the 1080p performance going in at 595 FPS and 1440p going at 502. Honestly, with how high refresh rate of a monitor you can possibly have, you're not going to see any sort of a difference on here. So let's go to some more higher fidelity games where we will see a bit more of a difference. Next is going to be Apex Legends. On the 3070 at 1080p, we're going at 165 FPS, and at 1440p, 145 FPS on average. If you're using 144 FPS refresh rate monitor, completely playable experience. However, throwing in the 7900XTX, we actually hit the engine cap on both resolutions of 1080p and 1440p of 300 FPS, regardless of the settings that I was using. I could technically run this game at 4K and probably still hit the engine cap using the 7900XTX. Next, for some Overwatch 2, 3070 at 1080p is running at 230 FPS on the highest settings, and at 1440p, 185 FPS on the highest settings. Once again, completely playable experience if you're running a bunch of esports titles. For the 7900XTX, however, we got something completely different. 310 FPS at 1080p, and at 1440p, we're averaging at 240 FPS, which means if you're one of those folks that got yourselves one of those 240Hz refresh rate monitors, this would actually be the perfect card to use if you're running at 1440p. Still playing with some multiplayer games here, sticking to Halo Infinite, big team battle mode for the most amount of players on screen on ultra settings. For the 3070 at 1080p, 85 FPS on average, and we barely saw an FPS difference once we jumped up to 1440p, going to 80 FPS. Now of course the 7900XTX being a more powerful card is going to jump up the frame rate quite a bit, 132 FPS on average at 1080p, with 1440p rocking at 112. And now for some Tiny Tina's Wonderland running on the badass setting. At 1080p for the 3070, we're running it at 115 FPS on average, with 1440p giving us at the 81. Just running the in-game benchmark here, really. And over at the 7900XTX, 1080p, 192 FPS on average, with 1440p going at it with 150. And now for some games that I want to consider an anomaly, in that the numbers that I got just didn't seem to make any kind of sense whatsoever. The first is going to be World of Warcraft's current expansion, Dragonflight, with the 3070 running it at 1080p, 100 FPS at the highest settings in the game, and at 1440p running it at 85 FPS. However, when I went over to the 7900XTX, and this number is correct from what I'm showing you here, at 1080p it was running at a lower frame per second than it was at 1440p. I was averaging at 140 FPS, whereas at 1440p I was running at 180 FPS. So to prove that I'm not totally crazy, I was trying to actually replicate this issue. We can see over here in game, I'm running at the highest settings, 1440p, averaging, just kind of looking from the top of the capital city here, mid 80s, high 70s, and we're going to flip it itself over to 1080p. You can see it just changed the resolution over here, still sticking to that as it kind of jumped down to 70s, back to 80s, going to the 90s. I'm not sure why it's doing that, and I couldn't replicate those exact numbers as I was getting that specifically in a raid. And when I go back over to 1440p, you can see that the resolution changes and everything, and now the frame rate is kind of high 80s, low 90s at 1440. I'm not sure why that's occurring. It's kind of an anomaly for me. The second anomaly that I thought was kind of weird but not as damning was playing Deaths Stranding, which it didn't seem to matter what resolution I was playing on, the FPS stayed the same when I was using specific graphic cards. For the 3070, regardless if I was at 1080p or 1440p, it was locked at about 110 FPS. And when I went over to the 7900XTX, both resolutions, 135 FPS. Barely that big of a difference, and something that just didn't change regardless of what was going on, but that's fine because the game is pretty well optimized. And now we're going to round this out with a couple of games that were actually giving trouble to the 3070 finally. First, we're going to start off with Fortnite, running on epic settings, which does turn on their Lumen engine, which is kind of like the Unreal Engine version of RTX. 1080p, 56 FPS on average, and at 1440p, 40 FPS on average, which I would determine kind of unplayable when it comes to a multiplayer title. When it comes to the 7900 XTX, however, 1080p, 124 FPS with 1440p at 90 FPS. Then, what we can always do is flip on the setting that turns on hardware ray tracing on these cards, and it does dip a little bit lower for the 3070, going at 1080p at 53 FPS and 1440p at 35 FPS. Back over at the 7900 XTX, with the hardware ray tracing turned on, 98 FPS at 1080p, and 1440p was granting us at 78 FPS. And this is the first time we saw an absolutely massive jump in playable performance between these two cards. Another title where we're going to test out ray tracing for these two cards is going to be Warhammer 40k Darktide, with the 3070 running it without RTX on right now, just on high default settings, 100 FPS at 1080p, and at 1440p, 80 FPS, completely fine for this nice zombie shooting game. For the 7900 XTX, a lot higher of a jump over here, 142 FPS at 1080p, and 1440p is granting us at 123. Now, when we turn the RTX mode onto high, the 3070 gets absolutely crippled trying to handle this game at all. Over on the 1080p side, we are running at 45 FPS, and at 1440p we're running at 30, which again I'm considering unplayable when it comes to a multiplayer shooter. The 7900 XTX, however, able to handle ray tracing like a dream. 1080p 85 FPS with the RTX turned on to high, and 1440p is running at 65 FPS. And for the final game we're going to look at, it's going to be a brand new one here, Resident Evil 4, the remake that came out this year in 2023, on prioritized graphics mode, aka high, for the 3070 at 1080p 120 FPS and at 1440p 75 FPS. For the 7900 XTX at 1080p 205 FPS, a preposterously high number, with 150 FPS over at 1440. Now, this is where things get a little bit crazy, and why we see that 8 gigabytes of video memory may not be enough for the future of gaming. When we take Resident Evil 4, we switch it over to the maximum graphics settings, we'll see that the 3070 doesn't actually have enough video memory to run this game at all. If you try to launch the game with the maximized settings, what ends up happening is the game attempts to load and then crashes the desktop every single time. It cannot run on maximum settings. Over on the 7900 XTX, however, since we have 4 times the video memory, that's right, 24 gigs of video memory, it's actually not only able to handle these settings, but it's also able to handle them very well at maximized settings, 1080p, 145 FPS with 1440p at 118. So the gains on newer titles going on to the 7900 XTX, especially with the 1440p resolution and ray tracing turned on, were substantial over what the 3070 was offering. But if you're already using something like a 3070 or a 6700 XT at that tier level, I generally wouldn't recommend jumping to such an extremely high-end graphics card as an upgrade, as the 3070 or the 6700 XT will work just fine at 1080p gaming on medium and high settings, especially if you have features like RTX turned off. You'll still enjoy a very good above 60 FPS experience over there. Me, I'm looking for that high-end, high-fidelity 1440p enthusiast tier gaming experience, but I was also in need of a beefier card with AV1 encoding support for higher quality video recordings at a lowered storage space. Well, that's it for this one. Thanks everyone again for watching. Check out our shop over at techlionpcs.com for some of the new builds that we have up for sale, and you can also now support us using our Patreon link down below. Like and subscribe for the next one. This is Leo signing out.